A warm July evening in Memphis. The studio still trembled with the aftershocks of rehearsal, but he was already in the hallway. Tired, sunglasses hiding his eyes, carrying that faint blend of tobacco and cologne that always followed him. The side door was almost shut when a voice stopped him. "Mr. Presley?" He turned. A woman stood there in a faded dress, rubber gloves damp from work. The cleaning lady. She didn't step closer, just held out a crumpled sheet of paper and a pen. "For my boy," she said, her voice careful, almost breaking. He can't write, but he loves your music." The air seemed to pause, the only sound a distant guitar drifting from another room. He took the pen, then hesitated. "What's his name?" "Tommy," she answered. A name weighted with tenderness, exhaustion, and hope all at once. He signed, his hand steady. But when he gave the paper back, something in his chest refused to let the moment end there. "Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story." He was almost at the door when it struck him. His thoughts weren't on the guitar leaning against its stand in the dressing room, nor on the set list waiting backstage. They weren't even on the roar of the crowd he'd just left behind. They were fixed on the face of a woman he'd spoken to only minutes earlier, and the quiet, almost hesitant voice with which she had thanked him. The night air pressed against him as he stepped out. The late summer heat carried a sluggish wind, heavy with the scent of asphalt and spilled beer from vendors outside the arena. He stood there for a moment, the noise of the crowd inside fading into a dull hum. Somewhere in the back of his mind, an image surfaced, a memory from boyhood. Someone, years ago in Tupelo, had done something small but unforgettable for him. A kindness that, though modest, had shifted something in him. He couldn't recall their face clearly now, but he remembered the feeling it left behind. An unshakable warmth in a world that had often been cold. He didn't head straight for the Cadillac. The car was waiting in the alley, driver alert, engine idling, but he turned away from it. His eyes found one of the security men leaning against the brick wall, scanning the street. "Find out where she lives," he said quietly. The guard's eyebrows lifted. "Why?" "Just find out." The man gave a short nod, reading in his tone that there would be no further explanation, and melted into the night. By the time the evening fully wrapped itself around the city, he was back under the harsh glare of the stage lights. Sweat gathered at his temples. His voice rode over the surge of the band, the familiar chords and shouts of thousands pressing forward like a tide. But in the middle of all that chaos, in the moments when his eyes should have been sweeping the sea of faces, they kept returning to one. Not hers, the woman he'd met briefly, but another face she had mentioned. Thin, pale. A boy. He didn't know the boy's name, had never seen him, yet it stood before him now in his mind's eye with more clarity than the crowd before him. He sang for thousands, but every note felt like it was heading toward that one face. The concert burned on. He was all fire and rhythm under the spotlights, hips snapping, guitar strings thrumming, crowd screaming like the roof would lift off. Yet, under it all, there was that steady undertow pulling him away from the show, toward something smaller, quieter, but infinitely more urgent. When it was over, he walked off stage to the sound of applause still spilling into the air like water over rocks. Back in the dressing room, his jacket clung to his shoulders with the dampness of heat. A bottle of water sat on the table, condensation pooling beneath it. Next to it lay a folded piece of paper. He picked it up, the paper warm from the lights and faintly creased, and recognized the security man's handwriting. An address. A street name he didn't know. He didn't open it fully, didn't read the details, just slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket, the way one might tuck away something fragile. The noise from the arena was dying down outside. Somewhere, his road manager was probably already talking about the next city, the next show, the schedule that would carry them on without pause. But his mind had already stepped off that schedule entirely. The decision was there, solid and unshakable. It wasn't about weighing pros and cons or figuring out timing. It was a feeling that had rooted itself the moment he heard the woman speak about her boy. As the others busied themselves, packing gear, calling for cars, he lingered in the quiet, the folded note pressing lightly against his chest with each heartbeat. He knew it would be soon. Not tonight, maybe, but soon. And when it happened, it would not be part of the show. It would be outside of it, beyond the reach of any spotlight. He finished his water in 2 slow swallows, eyes unfocused, hearing not the voices around him, but a memory of his own mother's voice, years ago, when someone had shown them mercy they didn't deserve and had no way to repay. That same thread was pulling at him now. Some things you do for the world to see. Others you do because they have to be done, quietly, like a seed dropped into the earth, trusting it will grow where no one's looking. And this was going to be one of those things. The house was still except for the slow, deliberate tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Its pendulum's swing was like a patient breath in the darkness. He lay in bed, arms behind his head, staring at the ceiling where shadows shifted with the faint light from the street lamp outside. The concert had ended hours ago. The roar of the crowd long faded, yet sleep refused him. His body was still in motion, his mind unable to land. In the quiet, he could hear the small noises of the night, the distant hum of the refrigerator, the occasional creak of wood settling, the faint rustle of leaves in the warm night air. The phone rang. Not the public line. That one was managed elsewhere. This was the private number, known to only a few. He reached for it. Hello? A woman's voice, low and careful. It took him a moment to place it. The cleaning lady who worked some evenings at the venue, the one who had stopped him before the show to ask for an autograph for her boy. Now her words came unevenly, as if she'd debated making the call at all. She apologized for disturbing him, but her son's condition had worsened. Worse than she'd told him before. The clock ticked in the silence between her sentences. He could picture her holding the phone in both hands, maybe in a small kitchen, lights low to avoid waking anyone. He could hear something in her tone, not desperation, exactly, but a thin edge of hope, stretched taut. He sat up. Where are you? She hesitated before answering, as if afraid to trouble him further. But when she told him, he recognized the street from the folded note still in his jacket. I'm coming, he said. You don't have to. I'm coming. He hung up before she could try to change his mind. No entourage this time, no long line of cars, just him, keys in hand, stepping into the heavy Memphis night. The air was warm, clinging. The garage door groaned upward, and he slid behind the wheel. The city lay ahead, quiet in places, restless in others. Halfway there, he slowed the car and pulled to the curb outside a corner store, its neon sign buzzing faintly. Inside, the light was sharp, washing over the narrow aisles lined with cans, bread, and candy. A teenage boy leaned on the counter, radio murmuring beside him. Elvis moved past the shelves, scanning the freezers until he found the ice cream section. He stood there longer than expected, staring at rows of neat paper cartons with bright-colored lids. Vanilla, chocolate, strawberry. The boy behind the counter looked up, recognition dawning, eyes widening in disbelief. You're... Yeah, Elvis said softly, as though it weren't important. "Tell me, what's the best ice cream for a kid who's only got one wish left in him?" The question hung in the cool air of the freezer aisle. The teenager blinked, caught off guard, then pointed to a carton speckled with bright bits of candied fruit. "This one," he said. "It's sweet. Real sweet." Elvis took 2 cartons and a small bag of sugar cookies from a shelf. At the counter, the boy kept glancing at him, as if afraid he'd vanish if he looked away. Elvis paid in cash, slid the bag into the crook of his arm, and with a brief nod, stepped back into the warm air outside. The streets narrowed as he drove deeper into the older neighborhoods. Porch lights here were dim, some flickering. A dog barked somewhere, the sound carrying over the stillness. In the distance, the skyline glimmered faintly, a reminder of the other life waiting for him, the one he was supposed to be living tonight. But as the car rolled to a stop in front of the small house, the world of spotlights and contracts seemed impossibly far away. The porch was unlit. Only a faint glow came from a window at the side, where the blinds didn't quite meet. He could hear the hum of a box fan working to push the heat around. He picked up the bag with the ice cream, stepped out of the car, and walked up the narrow path toward the door. The wood beneath his feet was worn smooth, the kind of surface you only get from years of weather and footsteps. The sound of his knock was soft, but in the stillness, it seemed to echo. From inside came the shuffle of movement, and then the door cracked open. Her face appeared in the gap, pale in the lamplight, eyes searching his. She didn't ask why he'd come. Maybe she already knew. He lifted the bag slightly, almost like an offering. Thought he might like this. She stepped back, opening the door wider. The cool sweetness of the ice cream, the faint sugary smell of the cookies, rose between them. Small things, but enough to make the night feel less heavy. Behind her, in the dimness, he caught sight of the hallway that led deeper into the house. Somewhere down that narrow passage, the boy was waiting. And with that thought, he crossed the threshold. The hallway smelled faintly of laundry soap and something sharper. Medicine, maybe, carried in from the room at the end. The floorboards under his shoes gave a muted groan as he walked, his steps measured, careful not to make more noise than necessary. The woman led him forward, her bare feet whispering against the worn rug that ran the length of the corridor. When they reached the doorway, she paused, hand resting on the frame as if asking for silent permission from the boy inside. The room was small, its corners softened by the low glow of a single lamp on the dresser. The shade was slightly crooked, casting a tilt to the light. A fan turned slowly in the window, the blades ticking faintly at the end of each revolution. Against one wall, a bed stood neatly made except for the mound beneath the thin blanket. A boy lying on his side, facing the window. Elvis stepped in, the bag of ice cream and cookies now resting on the dresser beside the lamp. He moved closer, crouching so his voice wouldn't need to travel far. "Evening," he said quietly, as if starting a bedtime story. The boy didn't stir at first. His breathing was slow, steady. Then, with a faint shift of the blanket, he rolled onto his back. His eyes opened, wide, dark, and unexpectedly bright for someone so pale. For a moment, they just looked at each other. The boy's lips parted slightly, but no sound came. Then a hoarse whisper. "You're really here." It wasn't awe, exactly. It was something quieter, deeper, as if the boy had been waiting so long for something impossible that now, faced with it, he was unsure how to believe it. Elvis smiled, not the practiced stage smile, but one that reached his eyes slowly, as though it had been pulled up from somewhere deep inside. "Looks like I am." He stayed there on one knee, talking in low tones, about nothing urgent. The way the night smelled of warm pavement, the sound of the cicadas outside, how strawberry ice cream always tastes best when it's almost too cold to bite into. The boy listened with the stillness of someone who doesn't want to miss a word. The woman stood just inside the door, her hands folded tight at her waist. Every so often her gaze moved between her son and the man at his bedside, as though measuring the moment's weight. Time slowed. The world beyond that room, the concerts, the contracts, the pressure, seemed as far away as another century. The only sounds were the hum of the fan, the faint ticking of the lamp's cord brushing against the wall, and the boy's occasional, shallow breath. Then came the muffled thud from outside. It was the kind of sound that didn't belong in a quiet street at this hour. The closing of a heavy car door, followed by another. A low, idling engine joined the night air, its bass note rolling through the floorboards. Elvis's head turned slightly, catching the sound without letting his attention drift from the boy. The woman shifted uneasily, glancing toward the hallway. He knew what it meant before she said anything. Someone had followed. Maybe his manager, trying to keep the night's schedule intact. Maybe a reporter, tipped off by someone who'd seen him on this side of town. The knock at the front door was firm, but not aggressive. He didn't move. For a long moment, he kept his gaze on the boy, who was now watching him intently, eyes searching for any sign he was about to leave. Elvis leaned in slightly. "Don't worry about that," he murmured. "They can wait." Footsteps crossed the porch outside, then returned to the idling car. The engine's hum remained, a reminder that the other world, the one of flashbulbs and deadlines, was parked just beyond the thin walls of this house. He reached for the blanket at the boy's side, tucking it more securely around his shoulders. "We've got time," he said. And in that room, with the lamplight stretching across the faded wallpaper and the air heavy with the mix of summer heat and human closeness, time seemed to stop entirely. The world could circle on without him for a while. The engine outside rumbled, but inside, the moment held steady, fragile, unhurried, untouched by the knock at the door. He let his eyes wander slowly around the room, careful not to let the gaze feel like scrutiny. The space was humble in a way that was almost painful to take in, not because of poverty alone, but because everything in it had been stretched to last far beyond its years. The wallpaper, once patterned with cheerful yellow daisies, had faded to a muted beige, the outlines barely visible in the dim lamplight. In one corner, a strip had curled away from the wall, revealing the pale plaster beneath. A wooden dresser stood by the window, its surface worn smooth in some places and rough in others, as though hands had rested there over decades. On the dresser sat a small collection of framed photographs. Most were black and white, their edges fraying. One caught his attention immediately. A grainy newspaper clipping laminated between two pieces of plastic, showing him on stage back in 1956. He remembered that performance. The cheap suit that didn't fit quite right. The single spotlight that seemed too bright. The thrill of being a young man chasing a dream he could barely believe was happening. The clipping had been cut unevenly, the jagged edge betraying that it had been done with dull scissors. Beneath the photo, the article's text had yellowed, the words blurred from years of handling. The boy followed his gaze. "That's from before I was born," he said, his voice faint but proud. Before Elvis could respond, his mother spoke quietly from the doorway. "He's been your fan since the first time he heard you on the radio. He used to save up pennies to buy the magazines, then cut out your picture and tape it to the wall." She paused, the weight in her voice deepening. "Then he got sick. Couldn't go out much anymore. Against the far wall sat a narrow bookshelf. On its top shelf was a squat record player, the kind with a hinged lid and built-in speaker. The surface of its dark vinyl covering was nicked in several places. Beside it leaned a stack of records, their sleeves bent at the corners from being pulled out and put back too many times. He stepped over to it, lifting the top record from the pile. The paper sleeve was so thin in spots he could almost see through it. Inside, the vinyl disc was dulled from years of use, its grooves lined with tiny scratches. He turned it gently in his hands and noticed the faint, uneven ring where the needle had worn its path over and over again. "You still play this?" he asked. The boy nodded, his eyes brightening a little. "Every day. Sometimes twice." Elvis lowered the record back into its sleeve, feeling a pang in his chest that had nothing to do with nostalgia. He'd seen gold records framed on walls in mansions, his own albums sold in numbers so large they barely felt real. But here was proof of something else, that the true life of his music wasn't in statistics or trophies. It was in the hands of people like this, who wore the grooves thin because they needed those songs to be close. He ran a finger along the record player's lid. The dust clung to his fingertip. It wasn't neglect. The boy's mother kept the house tidy, but the kind of inevitable layer that came from long, slow months, in a room where the world outside moved faster than the one inside. The air carried a faint scent, not unpleasant, but telling. A mixture of fabric that had been washed too many times to hold any softness, the sharp edge of disinfectant, and the dryness of paper and dust. In the silence, the fan clicked again. From outside came the low growl of the car still idling at the curb, a reminder that the other life, the one full of motion and deadlines, was still waiting for him to step back into it. He didn't move toward the door. Instead, his gaze lingered on the worn edge of the bedspread, the places where the threads had frayed into soft tassels from years of being gripped and pulled. He looked at the boy, then at the wall where the old clippings were taped in a crooked line. This was the reality behind the faceless crowds and the glowing marquees. This was where the music had landed and stayed. Somewhere behind him, the woman shifted her weight, the floor creaking softly. He glanced toward her and caught a flicker in her expression. Part gratitude, part worry, as though she wasn't sure how long he could stay in this small world before being pulled back into the larger one. He gave her a slight nod, a quiet promise that for now he wasn't going anywhere. From the dresser, the needle of the record player rested in its cradle, waiting. He imagined the sound it must make when it drops, that faint scratch before the music begins, and for a brief moment he could almost hear it in his mind, merging with the hum of the car outside. The two sounds, one intimate and fragile, the other loud and mechanical, pressed against each other, and he felt himself choosing which one he'd listen to. The air outside was cooler than it had been an hour ago, carrying with it a faint scent of damp earth from somewhere down the block. The porch boards flexed under his weight as he stepped out, the screen door easing shut behind him with a tired spring. The street was quiet except for the low, steady rumble of the idling limousine parked at the curb. Its chrome trim caught the thin glow from the nearest street lamp, reflecting it in pale ribbons along the black paint. One of the security men stood near the front bumper, his hands clasped behind his back, scanning the shadows. The other leaned against the passenger side, his posture stiff with impatience. Somewhere beyond them, the city was already winding itself up for the next show. Trucks being loaded, schedules being shifted, tickets waiting to be sold. From the driver's seat, the chauffeur watched him approach. The tinted window slid down just enough for his manager to lean into view, his voice pitched low so it wouldn't carry toward the house. "You're cutting it close," he said. "We're supposed to be on the highway already." Elvis didn't answer right away. His eyes were on the darkened windows of the house he'd just left. Behind one of them, a boy lay in a narrow bed, his world contained within those walls. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady. "Tell the driver to take them to the hospital first." His manager blinked. "Them?" "The boy and his mother. There's a man I know there, a doctor. He's good, one of the best. He'll see them." "That's not on the schedule," the manager said, trying to keep his tone measured. "If the press gets wind of this—" "This isn't for the press." The words were quiet but unyielding. "It's not for anyone to write about." The security man by the front bumper shifted, glancing between them as if expecting the argument to escalate. But it didn't. The manager exhaled through his nose, recognizing that particular tone, the one that meant the decision had already been made, and no amount of reasoning would move it. "You'll be late," he said finally. Elvis's gaze didn't leave the house. "Then I'll be late." The air between them held for a moment longer before the manager pulled back into the car, the tinted glass sliding up with a faint mechanical hum. Elvis stepped down from the porch, his shoes crunching lightly on the gravel that bordered the walkway. The sound seemed loud in the stillness, each step marking the distance between the worlds he was balancing, one of rigid timetables and one of quiet necessity. At the base of the steps, he paused, tilting his head slightly as if listening. From inside the house came the soft rustle of movement. Perhaps the mother checking on her son, perhaps the boy shifting beneath his blanket. The night was warm, but a light breeze moved through the street, carrying with it the faint bark of a dog somewhere 2 blocks over. It was the kind of detail that rooted him in the present, that reminded him of streets he'd walked as a boy, when the world was small enough that every sound belonged to someone you knew. He walked past the limousine to the driver's side, leaned in, and gave quiet instructions. The driver nodded once, his expression unreadable. But there was a flicker of something, maybe respect, maybe understanding, before he rolled the window back up. Behind him, one of the guards cleared his throat. "Boss," he said hesitantly, "if you want, I can run the route to the hospital first. Make sure it's all set." "That'd be good," Elvis replied without turning. His tone carried no command, only the calm of a man who had decided where the night was going. He stood there for another moment, hands in his pockets, eyes on the house. He didn't need to see the boy again to know the image would stay with him. It was already fixed. The lamplight, the thin blanket, the look in the boy's eyes when he realized who was sitting beside him. A car passed at the far end of the block, its headlights sweeping briefly across the front of the house before disappearing into the dark. The limousine's engine hummed on, patient but expectant. When he finally moved, it was with a slow, deliberate step, the kind that said there was no hurry to return to the other side of the night. The gravel shifted under his shoes, giving way to the smoother path that led back toward the doorway. Inside, the room would be quiet again, the boy perhaps already drifting toward sleep. And he intended to be there, not as a star on a stage, but as a man who had chosen, for tonight, to let the show wait. The faint crunch of gravel underfoot faded as he crossed the threshold again, replaced by the muffled sounds of the small home, the whisper of fabric, the gentle creak of old floorboards, and somewhere deeper inside, the steady rhythm of a boy's breathing. The boy's eyelids were growing heavier now, the fight to stay awake losing ground to the slow pull of fatigue. His breathing had settled into a quieter rhythm, each inhale shallow but even. The lamp on the dresser still cast its warm cone of light, but its glow seemed softer now, as though the night itself had leaned closer around the room. Elvis sat in the chair by the bed, his elbows resting lightly on his knees. He spoke in a low, easy tone, not to keep the boy awake, but to let him drift off with something gentle in his ears. The words weren't about anything important. A story about a hound dog that used to follow him home as a kid. A memory of the way his mama could make cornbread smell like Sunday mornings, no matter what day it was. From the doorway, the mother watched. She'd leaned against the frame, her arms crossed loosely, her face softening with something he couldn't quite read. Relief, maybe, mixed with the worry she wore like a second skin. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I can't remember the last time he smiled like that." Elvis looked over his shoulder. Her eyes glistened in the dim light, though she made no move to wipe them. "It's a good smile," he said quietly. "He ought to have more of it." She stepped into the room, resting her hand gently on the back of the chair. "I don't know if the doctor can fix things," she admitted, "but tonight you gave him something." The boy stirred slightly, his head turning on the pillow. Without opening his eyes, he murmured, "Mama, when I get big, I'm gonna buy you a house with a big porch. Big enough for you to sit outside and drink coffee every morning." The words were slurred with sleep, but clear enough. They landed in the room like a pebble dropped into still water. Small, but sending ripples everywhere. Elvis felt them most of all. He knew, in the quiet way some men just know, that the boy might never get the chance to make good on that promise. The thought pressed into him, slow and heavy, settling in the space between his ribs. He stayed there until the boy's breathing smoothed into the deep rhythm of sleep. The fan in the window kept up its steady turn, the faint clicking now the loudest sound in the room. When he rose, it was with deliberate care, so as not to wake him. He followed the mother out into the hallway. The house felt cooler here, though it might have been the shift from lamplight to the dimness of the corridor. They moved toward the front door, their footsteps soft against the old rug. Outside, the limousine's engine still murmured on the street, but it no longer seemed to intrude. It was just part of the background now. On the porch, he paused, leaning one hand on the railing. The night sky was clear, a stretch of dark velvet pricked with stars. Somewhere far off, a train horn sounded, long and low. "I had a neighbor once," he began, his voice carrying the cadence of a memory. "When I was just a kid. Times were lean, and he knew it. One night he showed up with a bag of groceries and left it at our door without saying a word. Never asked for anything back. Never even told us it was him. But it changed how I saw people. Changed how I wanted to be." She listened without speaking, her fingers curled lightly around the edge of the porch rail. "I've been lucky," he went on. "Luckier than I deserve. But I've never forgotten that bag of groceries." He didn't say what he was thinking, not yet. But the seed of it had already taken root. The sense that just paying for a doctor's visit wasn't enough. There was more to be done, something that would carry beyond tonight. Down the block, a car turned the corner, its headlights sweeping briefly over the houses before vanishing again. The night settled back into its quiet. He straightened, looking out toward the street, but his eyes were far away now, tracing the edges of an idea that was starting to take shape. Not a grand gesture for the sake of applause, something quieter, more enduring. For a moment, the sound of the city felt distant, like it belonged to another world. Here, the only things that mattered were behind that thin front door. A sleeping boy and a woman who had been carrying the weight of both hope and fear for longer than anyone should have to. A faint vibration came up through the porch boards as the limousine shifted into a lower idle, the driver likely glancing at his watch. Elvis didn't move. He let the thought sit with him, knowing that by morning he'd be ready to act on it. The night air brushed against his face, warm but easing, as if the world itself had slowed its breathing. Somewhere in the dark, a promise was being made, not out loud, not yet, but as certain as the dawn that would soon start to break. Dawn arrived like a curtain lifting. The street was nearly empty, just a line of small houses facing the pale stripe of sky where the sun was starting to show. Porch steps gleamed a little with dew, and the smell of wet grass drifted up from patchy front lawns. Somewhere, a newspaper thumped against concrete, and a screen door whispered shut. From around the corner came a steady, low-throated growl, not loud, but sure of itself. A long black Cadillac Fleetwood eased into view, its grille catching the first thin blade of sunlight. It wasn't the glossy caravan that trailed the tours, not the bus with the bold lettering and the chatter of roadmen. This was his car, the one he used when he wanted to pass through the city like any other man. Behind it rolled two modest sedans, paintwork dull with road dust, their drivers attentive but discreet. The Fleetwood pulled to the curb with the grace of something heavy handled by careful hands. The engine quieted, and the door opened on its own well-oiled hinge. He stepped out in a plain leather jacket and dark trousers, hair brushed back. No sparkle, no stage glitter, just a morning face and a purpose that had not slept. He rounded the trunk as the driver popped it, lifting the lid to reveal neat stacks of boxes. Cardboard ruled with pencil, parcels bound with twine, fragile stamps bleeding purple on brown paper. He picked up two at once, then another, arms straining slightly under the weight. The guards moved to help, but he shook his head with a brief smile and handed them the rest. Neighbors noticed. Curtains stirred, then stilled again, the respectful curiosity of people who knew when to give a moment room. A boy on a bicycle rolled slow, brakes squeaking, then coasted on, glancing back once with a look he'd remember all day. The house's front door opened a fraction. The mother stood there in yesterday's dress and a fresh resolve. Sleep had barely touched her eyes. When she saw him coming up the path with those boxes, she stepped aside, uncertain whether to be grateful or worried for what might follow. "Morning," he said, the word shaped like a promise rather than a greeting. "Morning," she answered, rubbing her palms down the front of her skirt, as if to smooth away the unreality of it. You came back. I said I would." He nodded to the parcels. "May I?" She moved out of the doorway, and he crossed the threshold, the guards following with the rest, careful with their steps, careful with their voices. The hallway seemed shorter in daylight, its paint a little more chipped than it had looked under the lamp. From the back room came the faintest cough, then the creak of bed springs adjusting. He set the first two boxes on the dresser, and with a pocket knife he clipped the twine and sliced through the tape. The cardboard gave a soft sigh as it opened. Inside lay a turntable wrapped in waxed paper, the tone arm secured with a red strap, the platter cradled in molded cardboard. In the next box waited a small amplifier and a pair of compact speaker cabinets, their cloth grills clean and taut, edges trimmed in thin chrome. From another carton he drew sealed records, crisp sleeves, corners sharp, cellophane reflecting the morning light in thin ripples. Not just his albums. He had brought the ones he'd leaned on when he was young and broke and reaching, gospel harmonies that could make a room feel like Sunday, blues records that smelled of riverbanks and summer heat, country voices plain as a front porch. The boy, roused by the sounds of paper and tape, blinked into wakefulness. He pushed himself up on his elbows, then sat higher with the help of the pillow, his breath catching more from surprise than effort. Color found his cheeks, where there had been none the night before. Elvis lifted the turntable from its bed and set it on the dresser. He checked the belt, balanced the tone arm, wired the amplifier with a practiced hand. The mother hovered, trying to offer help without interfering, swallowing questions about cost, about why, about what any of this might mean tomorrow or the day after. When the cables were in place, he brought one speaker to the foot of the bed and set the other on the dresser so the sound would meet in the middle of the room. He peeled the cellophane from a record with the slow satisfaction of a man unwrapping a long-awaited letter. The sleeve slid free, and out came the vinyl, deep black, grooves unscarred, label bright. He turned to the boy and lowered his voice as if sharing a secret. "You told me you wanted to hear music again," he said. "Now hear it, the way it's meant to be heard." He placed the record on the platter and set the speed. The tone arm hovered above the first track, and for half a breath the room held perfectly still. Even the hallway seemed to lean in. He let the needle fall. A tiny static whisper, then sound blossomed. Not loud, not yet. A clear, clean ribbon filling the space, every instrument standing where it belonged, the voice threading through like a hand fitting into another. The boy's eyes widened, then widened further when the bass line reached him from the speaker at his feet, while the melody kissed his ear from the dresser. He laughed. First, a startled burst, then a sustained bell-bright run of joy that didn't belong to hospitals or prescriptions or anything else that had weighed this room down. The laugh rang against the thin walls, ran down the hallway and out onto the porch, where the breeze caught it and nudged it into the street. He adjusted the volume a notch, not to show off, but to settle the sound right where it held the room without pushing it. The mother pressed a hand to her mouth and the other to her chest, as if to keep both halves of her heart steady. She looked at him with a question she didn't quite speak. "Why are you doing this? Why this much? Why so soon?" He answered none of it yet. The bigger thing sat unmentioned, waiting in the quiet space behind his eyes, shaped and ready, but not to be opened here, not in front of the boy. There would be a moment for that, and it would belong to the two adults alone. Instead, he reached for a fresh sleeve and set it beside the turntable, then pulled a small box of spare needles from another parcel and placed it neatly where the boy could see. "Records are like people," he said gently. "Treat them right, and they'll give you their best for a long time." Another laugh, softer now, threaded with disbelief, bubbled from the bed when the chorus came around. The boy tried to clap along and managed a few taps against the blanket before sinking back, grinning as if the sound itself were lifting him. Outside, the Fleetwood waited in the brightening day, windows fogged lightly by the cool air inside meeting the warm morning. In the street, the bicycle boy had returned and stopped at the corner, listening without looking, pretending to check his chain. Somewhere a kettle began to whistle in a neighbor's kitchen. Inside, the tape peeled from one more box with a slow, sticky rip, and the room answered with another clear peal of laughter, higher, freer, as if the music had reached in and untied a knot that had been there too long. When the second record began to spin, its first notes curling softly into the room, he caught the mother's eye and tilted his head toward the porch. She hesitated, glancing at her son, who was now leaning into the sound as though it were the only thing holding him up. "I'll just be a minute," he told the boy. "Don't let the music end without me." The boy smiled faintly and nodded, his gaze fixed on the turning vinyl. In the hallway, they passed the stack of opened boxes, their flaps sagging, the scent of fresh cardboard and machine oil lingering from the new equipment. The boards beneath their feet had a different tone here, more hollow, as if the space had been walked 1,000 times without the weight of joy. Outside, the day had gained warmth. The sun, now higher, threw pale gold across the street, catching on the windshield of the Cadillac and making the chrome shimmer. They stopped beside the car. The driver looked away politely, focusing on a distant point down the road, giving them the privacy that words like these demanded. From inside his jacket, Elvis drew a plain manila envelope, its flap sealed with a single strip of tape. He turned it once in his hand, before holding it out to her. She took it carefully, as if its contents might be fragile. "What is this?" she asked, her fingers pressing lightly at the edges. "Something I should have done sooner," he said. "Inside are the keys to a house in Memphis. A good house, quiet street. It's in your name. The papers are there too." Her breath caught. "I can't. I couldn't take this. It's too much." "It's not a gift," he said, his voice steady but soft. "When I was a boy, somebody gave my family a chance we didn't expect. We didn't earn it, and we couldn't pay it back. This is me paying it forward. It's a debt I owe to life itself." She shook her head slowly, almost dazed. "I wouldn't know how to thank you." "You don't have to," he said. "Just use it. Let him have space to breathe, to grow, to see more than these four walls." Her hands trembled slightly as she held the envelope against her chest. The street was quiet, except for the gentle tick of the Cadillac's cooling engine. "There's one thing," he added, his eyes meeting hers with a clarity that allowed no misunderstanding. "This stays between us. No headlines, no photographs. No one needs to know except you, me, and him. Can you promise that?" "I promise," she said. He nodded once, and in that moment, the formality of the arrangement dissolved into something warmer, something unspoken. The kind of trust that doesn't come from contracts or signatures, but from looking another person in the eye and knowing they'll keep their word. She looked down at the envelope again, her thumb tracing the seam of the flap. "You've changed everything for us," she whispered. He shook his head slightly. "I've just opened a door. You'll do the rest." From inside the house came the faintest drift of music, the record nearing the end of its side. The sound carried just far enough for both of them to hear the last verse before it would fade into the low hiss of the needle waiting for the next song. He stepped back toward the porch, pausing to glance once more at the envelope in her hands. For a moment, the rising light caught the edge of it, making it glow faintly. Not from the paper itself, but from what it meant. When they reached the doorway again, she lingered behind him, slipping the envelope into the deep pocket of her dress as though tucking it into a vault. He crossed the threshold first, the smell of the house wrapping around him, the faint sweetness of ice cream from earlier, the dry scent of old paper from the clippings, the hint of warmth from the amplifier's tubes. The boy turned his head toward him, the beginnings of a question on his lips. Elvis smiled and said only, "Didn't miss the ending, did I?" The boy grinned. "Not yet." He settled into the chair by the bed again, his hands loose on his knees, the envelope no longer in sight, but the weight of what it held resting quietly between them. Outside, the sunlight stretched across the street, touching the Cadillac, the sedans, and finally the edge of the porch, where it seemed to pause before creeping further in. Inside, the next record waited in its sleeve, ready for another needle drop, ready to keep the room full just a little longer. The Cadillac's door closed with a muted, decisive sound. The engine turned over, a deep, smooth purr filling the morning air. Tires shifted against the loose grit of the road. Slowly, the long car eased away from the curb, its shadow gliding over the cracked pavement, past the leaning telephone poles, and the thin strip of grass between sidewalk and street. From the living room window, the mother watched until the car disappeared at the far end of the block, its black silhouette melting into the brightness of the day. She didn't move for a moment after it was gone, her hand resting lightly on the windowsill as if holding the image in place just a little longer. In the back room, the boy sat cross-legged on his bed. The turntable was spinning, the arm resting neatly in the groove of a fresh record. From the speakers came a voice he knew as well as his own heartbeat, clear, unhurried, filling every corner of the room. He turned toward the doorway when she stepped in. "Will he come back?" he asked, his tone not demanding, not pleading, just wondering, as if she might have the answer tucked away. She crossed the room and sat beside him, smoothing a crease in the bedspread with the palm of her hand. Her eyes traced the faint line of sunlight that had found its way through the curtains, spilling across the floor and up the side of the dresser. "Sometimes," she said at last, brushing her fingers through his hair, "the best people only show up when you need them most, and that's enough." He seemed to consider this, his small hands resting on his knees. The music swelled gently behind them, the sound richer now than it had ever been on the old player. He leaned back on his palms, letting the notes settle into him. The mother didn't tell him about the envelope. Not yet. She didn't speak of houses or keys or the kind of change that rearranges a life in one swift, quiet act. Those things could wait. For now, what mattered was here. The boy, the music, the stillness between them. Outside, the street resumed its slow rhythm. A dog barked twice, then stopped. A screen door banged shut somewhere down the block. Life, ordinary and unremarkable, kept moving forward, as if nothing unusual had happened that morning. Weeks passed, then months, and then the summer of 1977 ended the way no one wanted. News drifted from radios and televisions, and strangers stood together on sidewalks, speaking in low tones about the man who had gone too soon. It was only then, much later, that the story was told. But only part of it. The mother spoke to a small-town reporter who came by the house. She told him about the night Elvis had shown up unannounced, about how he'd sat at the edge of the bed and listened as her son spoke in a whisper. She told of the ice cream, the laughter, the music that had filled the room like light pouring in from a window thrown open. She left out the rest. The new house, the envelope, the way his eyes had carried a promise as clear as any words he'd said. Those belonged to her and the boy alone, guarded like a family heirloom too precious for display. The article ran in a corner of the paper, beneath a headline that was already a week old. Most people skimmed past it, moving on to the larger tributes, the public memorials, the photographs of crowds gathered at Graceland's gates. But for those who read it, the story stayed. Not because of what he gave, but because of how he'd been there. Present, attentive, unrushed. Back in the boy's room, the turntable still worked. The records, though played often, were kept in their sleeves, edges straight, grooves clean. Sometimes, late at night, he would sit cross-legged again, lower the needle, and let the opening hiss give way to that voice. On those nights, when the last chord faded, the room would hold a silence so complete it felt like the music was still there, just beyond hearing. The fan might hum, the house might settle. But for a few moments, the only sound was the soft crackle of the needle tracing the runout. Then, with a slow, practiced motion, he'd lift the arm, return it to its cradle, and watch the platter spin down to stillness. The quiet afterward was different from ordinary quiet. It was shaped by the memory of the man who had once filled it. The boy would lie back then, eyes closed, hearing the echo of a laugh, the murmur of a voice telling small, easy stories. And though he didn't say it aloud, he knew she'd been right. Some people arrive only when you need them, and when they leave, they never really go.